Okay, excuse me, good morning. This is the June 11th, 2021 Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee meeting. Our agenda is posted on the website and kind of typical form. Our first item is to approve this week's draft agenda and the minutes from last week's meeting. And then we're going to have a presentation and discussion with Judy Dow around traditional ecological knowledge. We'll have a break for, actually before that, we're going to get a quick update from Jane on some of the latest and greatest with the Climate Council. Then we'll hear from Judy. We'll have a break for some public comment, then go through some other administrative updates around our task group work and the framing of our strategies and recommendations, discuss locking down our schedule for future presenters, and then have some unstructured time to talk about broader policy issues before we wrap it up with our final public comment opportunity. So any questions on that agenda or comments on the minutes from last week? All right, seeing none, I think we've successfully approved those. So I'll turn it over to Jane for some brief updates.
Sorry, I took a big bite. Morning, everybody. Nice to see you. Okay, I just have a few. I have to start with the most exciting one, which is that we have an executed technical analysis contract, which is really great. So the contract went in place this week, and we have the main consultant for everybody is Cadmus. So Cadmus will be working with us along with their team, which includes folks from UVM, EFG, based in Vermont, as well as Harvard. And so we'll have a nice group of consultants working with us to implement the technical analysis components, largely related to mitigation reductions. But as you all know, one of the other components they'll be looking at to complement their critique of the way we do our greenhouse gas inventory in Vermont is also to be thinking about a carbon budget. And so the greenhouse gas inventory critique and the carbon budget are sort of first out of the gate for the consultants to be working on. We have a project kickoff meeting next week. That hasn't been finalized yet for the date and time, but we're trying to schedule it for Wednesday afternoon. There are so many people who are going to be at that meeting from the Cadmus team that I've given them a few windows of time, but didn't feel like I could coordinate with all of the right people from all the subcommittees to be there. I'm not necessarily thinking it was the right time to engage with everybody yet. That said, because some of the components that we'll talk about is on how we move forward with the greenhouse gas inventory, how we move forward with the carbon budget, as well as how we move forward with coordination with the contract that is with the Public Service Department around LEAP modeling. Those are the three main substantive tasks that we'll talk about. My intent is to forward the agenda specifically to the carbon budget task leads and welcome you to join for all of the meeting or around that agenda item if you'd like to be there. And if it doesn't work for you, know that a more focused meeting on that task is forthcoming after that meeting. So sort of stay tuned, but I do plan to forward the invite as well as the agenda with the folks coordinating that task. So that's great. We had started to have some of the rollout of the technical analysis this week, actually at cross-sector mitigation, as well as the science and data, which included a presentation from SCI, which is the consultant working with the Public Service Department on the LEAP modeling that will influence our technical analysis. They presented the business as usual model that is now complete, which I suspect there'll be some revisions to based on the projections they used within it, but it's a really interesting model that shows the best case of what would happen with our emissions if nothing changed, if we just had the current policies in place between now and 2050. And so I would encourage folks, if you're interested in that, the science and data meeting in particular from this week went into more detail than the cross-sector mitigation meeting did, and asked some really good questions, as well as challenged some of the projections that were in there, because I'll say that most people were pretty surprised at actually how far we would get with emissions reductions if we did nothing. And so I think people aren't assuming that's necessarily accurate. So look at that if you're interested, and we'll be moving forward also with our own contract with FCI, recognizing that FCI will need to be available to assist Cadmus and others with the transition of the LEAP model to them. I'll pause there and see if there's any questions around the technical analysis contract.
Jane, just a clarifying question. The discussion that you just referenced, that took place in the Science and Data Subcommittee meeting?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So that recording is up and live now for folks to look at. We had a steering committee meeting on Monday this week with all of the co-chairs from the subcommittees. We were focused on any obstacles in the way of the subcommittees to meeting the end of July deadline with the development of strategies, as well as spent a little bit more attention and detail on the just transitions work that is now currently available for review, that I have sent to all of you on behalf of the Just Transitions Subcommittee, that has a memo inviting you all to the Just Transitions workshop next Thursday evening during the 4 to 5:30 timeframe. We are encouraging as many council members and subcommittee members to join that session to get a more in-depth look at the guiding principles and consider how to apply them, and what our thought process is with Just Transitions around their application going down the road, because we're thinking about how to apply them consistently, and how that might actually lend itself possibly to another contract rather than having subcommittees do them themselves. So I'll just suggest there's more to come there, and I encourage you to join the meeting next Thursday night. And if for some reason that time doesn't work for you, that too will be recorded, and we will strongly suggest that all subcommittee members and council members view the recording if you can't be there in person. So stay tuned. An agenda. We worked last night, the co-chairs and I met with David in lieu of a Just Transitions meeting to plan the agenda and workshop. So an agenda and some suggested homework is coming from that group of co-chairs, I think, today. Any questions there or anything to add, Iris or Abby? I think Abby was on here too, I saw. And the only other thing that I'll just mention at this moment is to sort of stay tuned for Abby and Billy in particular, but since it relates to everybody, as the state of emergency is lifted next week on this, in Vermont, open meeting law changes, and we have to have a physical location for every subcommittee meeting, every steering committee meeting, every council meeting as of Tuesday has to have an actual physical location. I found that out yesterday. And so that also means that there has to be someone staffing every meeting and location physically. And so there'll be an email to co-chairs about what that means for folks in the coming weeks. But your next meeting next week will have to have a physical meeting location and a staff person there to staff it. And I can pick up the heat if you can't get somebody there, but my expectation is that subcommittees will have either a co-chair, state employee, and or a staff member who staffs the subcommittee handle those. So that's what the email will say. So it's coming. Thanks, everyone. That's all I have for today.
Thanks, Jane. We should talk more about that. I heard about that yesterday as well. And I think there's some questions about whether we'll even be like technologically able to run a sort of hybrid meeting in physical settings. So obviously there'll be some more discussion between now and then, but thanks for flagging that. And that is not something that's specific to the Climate Council work. That in theory is true for all kind of warned public meetings statewide. So we'll see how people adjust to that.
Yeah.
Great. Any questions for Jane before we move on? Okay, thank you. All right, we've got now about 35,
Really?
40 minutes. Yes.
I'm sorry. I feel like I haven't been doing credit to the other thing that I should tell everybody is that I haven't shared that we've hired a Global Warming Solutions Act coordinator with the subcommittee.
Okay.
So for everybody, just so you know, we've hired Marianne Wolf from Vermont Emergency Management. She will be stepping into the role of the GWSA coordinator position starting on Monday, June 21st. Marianne brings a wealth of experience with planning and helping put together the landscape emergency management plan. She seems like she just has a ton of knowledge and experience in this sector and space, and she just has a lot of energy. We're really excited that she chose to come to work with us. So stay tuned, but she'll be starting June 21st, so she'll be another face at a lot of meetings coming up.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Okay, so we've got about 40 minutes now to learn about and discuss TEK. Judy has graciously agreed to provide us a presentation to kind of kick off that conversation, and then we should have plenty of time for questions and opportunity to discuss how that thinking can inform the work of our subcommittee. So Judy, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I can share the screen, right?
Yep,
Can you see this?
sure can.
Okay. So first I want to thank Jane for the fact that seeing fairness for all things made it into the principles, the guiding principles. That was awesome. Thanks.
You should thank Iris too, because Iris is here. She's been a great voice for that too. So
great. Thanks, Iris. Traditional ecological knowledge, also known as TEK, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, they're all areas that address a way of thinking, a way of looking at the environment. So for us, we have our oral traditions, we have our oral stories, and we have longevity. We have many, many, many generations of people who know that this usually happens then, and that happens here and then, and how and why. And so things like what we now call January thaw is called Moon of the Popping Tree for us. And it's called Moon of the Popping Tree because the warm sun in the daytime thaws the inner part of the trees and then quickly freezes at night, and it pops the skin of the trees. And so then insects and birds get in and the tree is damaged. And so that kind of knowledge gets passed on year after year after year, and generation after generation, and we share that. Just as you see settlers who have kept long, lengthy journals about phenology and what's happened on what day, it's the same thing. It's just knowledge being passed on, and it's not to control nature. Whereas Western science often has the process of observation and then form a hypothesis and then do some testing. And most often that Western science will try to control nature, try to control the ecological knowledge they've acquired. So it might be something like a dam, or I'm trying to think of other things, but it might be something like that they use to simply control what's happening. So there's different levels of analysis. So local knowledge and land and animals is often contribute to that. That the understanding the weather I can remember 10 years ago getting a letter from a friend of mine in Alaska, and she said, "Will you please tell everybody down there that it's getting too hot up here?" Um, so it's that knowledge of things as simple as the weather and the ranges that the animals and the plants are taking. I mean, we have seen many plants walking north. We have seen, sycamores walking north and possum walking north. And so what we have here is also going to walk north. And so we have to get used to the fact that there's going to be changes, and that local knowledge is going to help us to understand those changes. So land and resource management promotes geographically diverse ecosystems, and it provides for biodiversity, connectivity, and an understanding that when you pull on something in nature, you're going to discover the rest of the world is connected. And Western science will do the same thing, but most often it wants to control how it's connected. And that's why I keep talking about all of these colonies, for lack of a better word, that are growing together as a clone of the elder in the middle. Social institutions are all about transmission of knowledge and learning how organizations and diversity can happen among those social institutions. So for us at Gedakana, we have 2 talking circles a week. We have gardens all over New England, and we are working on reclaiming traditional knowledge as far as growing and pest control. And so we discuss problems we're seeing and how we can solve the problems. And then the last one is the worldview, which of course promotes values and our values. And our values are basically the 5 R's: respect, responsibility, relationship, reciprocity, and reverence. And so I'm kind of digitally challenged. I couldn't figure out how to put a circle in the middle, but it's all these 3 things together: cultural practices, cultural beliefs. It's traditional to adapt, and adaptation is traditional. So that place where they all intersect is traditional ecological knowledge. And that's where that longevity comes from, being passed on from generation to generation. So here's an example. This is a white birch, and this is what I was talking about with the moon of the popping tree. See up here how the birch is exfoliating? So the birch has learned during January thaw that this warm climate is going to come in the day, and at night it's going to freeze up again and split its skin if it's not prepared. So the tree has learned to adapt by exfoliating its bark and staying white. That's a form of adaptation. Evergreens have adapted by making their branches go way to the low to the ground to shade their trunk. And other trees have a very rough bark to act like fin tube. The heat hits it and it bounces right back off. So it never heats long enough during the moon of the popping tree to pop its skin. And so we want to make sure we do things to help them control the adaptations they already have. So trees like beech and oaks, they haven't finished their evolution, and so they still leave their leaves on. In the winter, when you walk through the forest, you'll see the trees with the beech leaves and the oaks, and they're waiting until the spring buds to pop their leaves off. And then once they finish their evolution, they'll have completed adaptations. And this is all knowledge that has been passed on for generation. And so for us, we understand that these lenticels are how the tree breathes, how the tree exchanges gases. We understand that there's an antifungal and an antibacterial property to this birch. And this is why our baskets were made of birch. This is why our dead were wrapped in birch for the 3-day ceremony, so they didn't decay while this is happening. This is why our food caches, the big holes in the ground, were lined with birch to prevent decay. And so now you see Western science catching up with that, and they're doing testing about this antifungal, antibacterial properties, and to see, well, yeah, maybe this might help to fight cancers. Maybe this might help to fight this. And so that knowledge, combining the two knowledges, is really beneficial. And that's why I think that it has to happen. They have to both be considered if the problem is going to be solved. This is Mount Sugarloaf down in Deerfield. Our stories fall into basically 2 categories: stories that are lessons to teach children. They do something wrong, they don't usually get punished, they get another lesson, another story. And so eventually you get sick of sitting there hearing these stories, and you solve the problem of what you've done wrong. The other stories we have are stories about historical events that happened. And this comes from a Paleo period story in which Lake Hitchcock was formed. And it was a battle between the giant beaver and Habamak, a warrior of that time. And the women were harvesting in the Wahanas, which is this floodplain that you see here. And it was filling up with water. And she goes to the beaver and she says, "You've got to stop building your dam. You're flooding our food, our wahana, our place where our food is." And he says, "No." The giant beaver says, "No, I want to bring my family here. I want to settle here." And so he keeps building. And it's all a metaphor for what's happened with the glacier. And the glacier is backing up the Connecticut River, and it forms Lake Hitchcock, which in turn backs up to the headwaters of the Connecticut and forms all the terraces that you see today along the Connecticut River that in some places are 2 miles wide. Well, the battle continues between Habamak and the giant beaver and over this land, and they eventually come to battle, and the Habamak hits the giant beaver in the neck and breaks his neck, and all the water is released. And that's the metaphor of the glacier finally receding past this area. So our stories are embedded with traditional ecological knowledge. If you don't understand a metaphor, you don't understand an indigenous story, because they're all based on metaphors. And they will help you to read the land. They will help you to understand what has happened in these places. And so our stories are filled with traditional ecological knowledge. Our language also. So there are 89 words in the language for water, and each and every one of them is connected to reading the land. So this is in Vernon. Here's the dam. The water comes back on itself. See how it's moving back on itself? And what happens is when we have snow water or water in the spring, it just goes straight across. It just floods it. And see this clay deposit sign? That connects with the root word meaning clay. And so this is a place where you can find lots of clay because the deposits for generations have flowed over. And up here off the map is one of the largest Benaki villages ever to be had in New Hampshire. And the archaeological reports show tons of pottery shard. So this was a place where pottery was made. And so when you look at the language or you learn the language, you began to understand how to read the land, which will again help you in conservation. Its adaptation is critical. Indigenous groups are projected to be among the most vulnerable in the face of climate change. This is in part because of their close ties and reliance on ecosystem goods and services. Because of this, it is important that climate change impacts and adaptation strategies be examined through an understanding of Western science and place-based TEK together. We need these tools together to make this happen. And so I tried to come up with a list of things to show you that you already know what some of this knowledge is. And this is by far not the whole list, but there's many, many here. And so I'm assuming you guys all know about Phoenix, Arizona, right? And so Phoenix was this place where the Chinampas were made. The whole town of Phoenix, or the whole city of Phoenix, were all these islands of food, and in between the islands were canals, and the canals were stocked with fish. The islands were lined with trees on the outside to keep the banks from eroding. And so people would paddle down the canals and fish. They would get the birds that came to the canal for food, and they would harvest all the food they had planted on the islands. And the whole entire city, if you can imagine, were these raised beds that were connected with gardening and all of these other things. So companion planting, all of these things are things that we're still trying to, at Gidakana, still trying to reclaim and figure out. And Lauren and Abby have been working with me this year to figure that out. So we have, like, Abby and I were talking before everybody got on. She's growing 2 heirloom corns for us. They have different times of propagating. So they're going to tassel off. Hopefully, what we're hoping for is they'll tassel off 10 days between each other. And so we can grow them closely and not have them cross-pollinate because of the timing and when they tassel off. And to prevent them from being attacked by raccoons or squirrels, she's got 2 heirloom squash that are also not supposed to cross-pollinate, that she's planting around the perimeter of this corn. And so it's just not companion growing that's important. She's also putting sunflowers in there to draw the heavy metals out of the ground and to distract the birds from wanting that corn. They'll go to the sunflowers instead, which is fine, right? So there's all of that type of knowledge that we work to reclaim. And so today in my gardens, I have 2.5-foot corn, and in between all the spaces of the corn, I'm growing tobacco. And so they're a companion plant that most people don't think of, but tobacco is important in our ceremonies, right? So all of these things are things that Western science has incorporated, but it just has to go a little bit farther. There has to be some of this stuff on this side included with the Western science around these things and the other things. I'm working with Walter Pullman at UVM right now on phenology. We've been a year down at the Interville documenting, when the shad bushes are in bloom in the highlands, the shadfish are running in the lowlands, and the shad bugs, the shad flies, are supposed to be there for them to eat when they start running, but they're not. They're not there for the shad to eat. The timing is off because of climate change. And so we're documenting all that phenology that's happening. And it's amazing how these animals and plants are adapting to this change. And that's what we have to do. We have to recognize that these changes are impacting things, and they're adapting, because some of them probably will not be able to adapt fast enough. And then the last thing I wanted to explain is that the UN has become involved in this. So wait a minute, I got to get your pictures out of the way. Indigenous peoples are the caretakers of the world's biodiversity and cultural diversity. Although they account for only 5% of the world's population, they care for an estimated 25% of the Earth's land surface. This land coincides with 80% of the planet's biodiversity and about 40% of all terrestrial protected areas and ecologically intact landscapes. Indigenous people matter. And so we've got to start thinking about that. I mean, we may be a small amount of people, but we're impacting a lot of the biodiversity in the world. And climate change, deforestation, all development, all of these things are contributing to threatening the livelihoods and the very lives of Indigenous people. And so I think that's my last one. I just wanted to kind of end on that. Yeah. So that we could have a discussion about any of this stuff. Anybody interested?
Thanks, Judy.
You're welcome.
That was excellent. And great food for thought for this group. Who has questions or observations or comments they'd like to share?
I don't know how to get out of this mode.
If you re-click on the share screen button, will it let you take it down? I don't know.
I'm trying to find it. Where is it?
Judy, if you hover to the top of your screen, like take your clicker and point way up there, a drop down menu should come and you say stop share, I think.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's not happening either. Oh, well. You get to look at me. Yeah, I don't know.
It might be that your screen is maximized, and if you hit escape on your keyboard, that might make it a little smaller, and then you might have the chance to.
Yeah, I did that.
Okay.
I don't know.
Whoever is the host of the meeting, I think, can take it back.
Oh, good. Okay, Billy, it's all yours.
Okay, let's see if I can figure this out. Stop participant sharing. There you go.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay.
So let's see. I'm not sure who had their hand up first, Billy. Do you, Charlie or Jane?
I don't know.
Charlie, you go first.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Judy. That was awesome. So I realize in the tradition, a lot of the stories that you kind of related to were probably passed down like orally, but I'm wondering, are there any resources, books or publications that kind of have a collection of those stories that kind of, especially that are applicable to like our landscape here in Vermont or in Northern New England or the Northern Forest in general? Because I mean, that kind of stuff, like, I love that. So I would love to just dig in more and kind of read more of that. And if that's not available, can I just tag along with you for like 2 months and like sit at your feet?
Yeah, there are lots of books out there. I can put together a list. There's an anthropologist in the early 1900s. I can't remember her name, Frances Densmore, I think it was. And she they had all these cylinder recording things, and they're at the Smithsonian. She recorded all these indigenous stories about land connection, and they're published in a book. I can't remember what the book's called, but I'll find out. And And I have taken every one of the stories she recorded and matched them to Western science. And it's taken 100 years for Western science to figure out every one of the stories that she recorded. But there are lots of books out there. And I know the University of New Hampshire right now is working on trying to determine if chaga, which is a fungus that grows on birch trees that have been injured, and it's used for medicinal purposes. They're now working to see if it causes, if it's a cure for cancer. So there are lots of stuff out there. I'll put together a list for you.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
I'd love to have your filter on it too, because I'm sure we can like Google stuff, but I'd love to have
Yeah.
your view of it specifically. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, first, just picking up, I wasn't going to say this, but if I don't know if anybody is a podcast junkie, but I love Radiolab, and they just had a recent one on Easter Island, where they were looking at the drug they use for transplants and heart stents and cancer, so many things that they found in the soil there. But it was just it's a really great podcast on that. But second, really wanted to say I was really struck by the statistic that you just mentioned around 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's biodiversity. That is something I never have heard before. It's a really striking statistic. And then I just wanted to say that out loud. And then lastly, what I really wanted to hear you speak to is picking up sort of on what Charlie was drawn to, the oral stories, and just thinking about like how to engage you and others to think more creatively about how we do our engagement around this work, and thinking about sort of lessons learned around like how not to do engagement and how not to get the right voices around the table, and just hearing any thoughts you have on public engagement broadly and how we reach different voices to ensure that they're in this process.
Well, I think different voices is critical because we all have such different stories. And you've heard me week after week after week about get out of your silo. Look how it's all connected. And for tens of thousands of years, this land has been cared for in a holistic way. And 400 years ago, when we got into these silos, we started changing things. And clearly now we see it didn't work. So we have to all be a united voice, and we have to look at it from various perspectives. Lauren and Abby and I are doing a program at the Middle School Institute at the end of June. And we're going to be reaching middle school teachers and talking about our perspectives on what this council is working on, and how these teachers can get their children, their students, into interacting with what we're all talking about. Because if we don't reach those guys, like, we're sunk. We have to reach the students, the young people now. And so I think it's going to take many voices, many perspectives to make that happen. And we have to look at it equally. Equity has to be a big role here. We can't say Western science is better than TEK, and we can't say TEK is better than Western science, because they are together. They complement each other. TEK never had half of the gadgets Western science has. And so I think we have to look at them as companions. Yes, I see Lauren's writing about Robin. Yes, Robin and I have done a lot of work together about around Maple Nation. And Maple Nation is a group of women on the Canadian US border who who are concerned about climate change. And we get together for conferences and we discuss issues that we see within our own communities and possible solutions. and Robin writes about them. She's written a lot of things like in Orion, and her books as well. Her books address a lot of them based on what the Maple Nation women are saying. Is there any other questions, or did that answer your question, Jane? Yeah.
Well, this is, in some ways, Judy, this is really more of a comment, but I'd love your reaction to it. I mean, I love the, I'm glad that you and Dr. Kimmer are connected. There was a really wonderful book group that the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Group, some staff have started that I was able to participate in. We read that book together, and there's a lot of interesting conversations that led to. I think in some ways, one of the messages I take from your presentation, and that your participation in this group that feels really vital as we think about our work, is that we're not thinking about our work in the context of there's the environment as though it's separate from people. That really, if we're going to solve and address these issues, we have to think about how people are engaged in and affected by the work that we're doing. And that connecting people to the land is such a vital piece of that work. And your last point about, connecting young people, it seems particularly important. So you're causing me to think about whether we should think about some of the organizations like Vermont Youth Conservation Corps and some other youth and service learning kinds of programs that have been fairly effective at bringing fairly broad and diverse groups of people to be engaged in the work of farming and forestry and involved in connections to the land. So that's a thought I'm taking as I'm reflecting on all that you've said, which is really, really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the one thing that is important for me is for people to see the land as kin. So it's connecting, it's developing a relationship, but it's also more than that. It's seeing the land, the water, whatever you want to talk about, as kin. And if you don't see it as kin and a relationship that you want to care for and love, you're going to have some serious problems. And you've heard me say TEK cannot be a box to check off. It has to be included in everything we discuss.
Alyssa, do you have a comment or question?
Yeah, Judy, I thank you for the presentation. I wish you could keep going and we could learn more. My first reaction was like, so many other people need to see this and learn this, and I want my kids to hear those stories. So thank you for all that you've done. I think that storytelling is a really compelling and powerful tool for all audiences. And I wondered if you could talk about any efforts there are to create new stories in light of like changing climate or changing conditions, and if that happens, and if that's something that could fit into the work that we're doing.
I do a lot of work in that area. I have recorded with Guilford Sound 11 stories, and many of them are brand new. Many of them are older and have this translated component that matches today. I use them in my classes. I'd be happy to share them with anybody that wants them. But basically, it's all about looking at the land through a lens that is never recorded. And I'm trying to think of the musician's name. She does that thing in North Beach. Burlington Harbor every year, that musical. Oh, I can't think her name. Grace Potter. So I worked with her a few years back, and I recorded a story with her, and we had this big tent where the story recorded all day. And there was an opportunity for children to come in and paint their perspective of the story of the creation of Lake Champlain. And so I think activities like that will draw young people in, and it will give them, you know, a chance to realize they're part of the story today. So, yeah. So for an old lady, I've worked with some pretty cool people. um, Neil Young, I don't know if you guys, Chris Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and Neil Young. I've worked with him also on the pipelines and tar sands, and his benefit concerts that he gives. And I think that's what has to happen. We have to bring these young people in. They have to see and hear these stories and realize it's their life today. The story is changing. They're adding to the story.
Judy, I love this so much, and I'm so, to Alyssa's point, I could listen, as you know, I could listen to you talk for days. So I wondered, you did bring in also some of the practices that we, you know, utilize through other terminology within our conservation framework, but that are also TEK. And so I'm wondering, is how do we honor the indigeneity of those practices that we've essentially co-opted into our Western lexicon, at this conservation lexicon at this point, but honor the indigeneity within them as we call them out further in this process? Is that a component of how we could honor Indigenous nations and their contributions historically to where, you know, to the methods that we utilize now as we build out our strategies? Like, just in terms of an equity lens, which we're going to have to be thinking about, you know, silvopasture is not Western science, that's an Indigenous practice. As you put, you know, coppicing, permaculture, all of those different things are Indigenous practices from various locales around the world. And so just thinking about our task ahead and moving forward with how we're building out this work, you know, is there a right way to interweave those that maintain the honoring properly of Indigenous nations and their work and their history?
Well, I think just the acknowledgement of where it comes from creates an educational point in which people then understand it's already a collaboration that's been happening. It's a collaboration between Western and traditional sciences. And I think that recognizing that's what it is an honor in itself. Then people don't have to fight so hard to say, hey, let's think about traditional ecological knowledge too, you know, because then just recognizing it is good. But I think even more than that, just using it to save this planet is the best honoring we could have. Using all that knowledge that tens and thousands of years has acquired.
So maybe a way that we could do this with more intent to honoring as we build this out is the education. You know, I think particularly this has come up in ag emissions a lot. I think a lot of those practices are fairly well accepted at this point as the way forward. You know, that the only way forward is to utilize a lot of those practices to adapt and remain resilient in the face of climate change. And so is a way that we could further build out that collaboration and that co-creation process by building that education into our conservation practices. In other words, you know, is that a component that we need to begin to integrate into our technical assistance, for example, as to how the conservation practices are referred to or taught, that there is an active acknowledgement within that of the fact that those are coming from TEK.
Well, that's where this whole land acknowledgement process comes into play. But right now, people don't really understand what the proper way of doing a land acknowledgement is. It's a part of truth and reconciliation. It's a part of reparation. And it's been asked for to acknowledge the history of this land, the land. So if you're thinking of a timeline, the story of the land is this long and the story of the people is this long. So you don't want to hear a land acknowledgement that goes on and on and on and on and on talking about the people. You want to hear a land acknowledgement that truly acknowledges the land. And so that's one way, and it's reparation that we've asked for and we've been receiving. And it just has to be done in a respectful way, and not everybody understands the proper way to do that. I'm sorry, I got to plug my computer in. It's dying on me. Yeah,
Judy,
go ahead, John. I'm just going to plug this in.
It's okay. Do you mind repeating the 5 R's that you, because I missed one of them and I'm in my notes.
Do I mind repeating what, John?
The 5 R's that you respect.
Yep.
I missed.
Respect, responsibility, reciprocity, reverence, and relationships. And sometimes some people add a 6R, and that 6R is relevance.
Okay, thank you. You know, that's now this was terrific, and I sit here just mulling over those. Yep, science, modern science is sort of having its moment when it's realizing that there's an awful lot of stuff out there that they don't understand or we don't understand, and trying to explain how birch trees can be a help to us beyond what we used to think of them as just firewood.
John, the interesting thing about birch trees is when you look at the longitudes between 40 and 70 degrees around the world, every cultural group uses birch tree to fight decay. So in Russia, they make these canisters to store their food in on the without a refrigerator. They just store it on the counter and it doesn't spoil. When you go to the Scandinavian countries where saunas are a big part of their culture, they make these birch shoes, woven birch shoes to wear in the sauna to prevent athletes' feet. And when you come over here, you find that we've been wrapping for centuries our deceased in birch to prevent them from decaying while we have the ceremony. When you go to the plains, they take bark, thin pieces of bark, birch bark, and they bite it into designs that have later become, they use their eye teeth to create these amazing bitten art that later became beading patterns, but originally were created as a way, a medicine, a way to heal.
Well, that makes me feel better that before I even knew this, I planted a bunch of birch trees on my farm this spring. I don't have a farm, on my piece of land this spring.
Good. They're walking north, just so you know. But we've talked a lot about economics, and this is a kind of funny story. Do you remember that Adirondack period when all these huge lodges were built with birch and birch canoes, birch design, everything, right? Well, the Abenaki people were hired to make birch bark canoes for these people who wanted these big lodges. And it's typical to make the canoe with the inside of the bark on the outside because the lentil sills are semi-permeable. They leak in one direction. And so the inside of the tree is on the outside. They made them, they gave them to the lodge owners. And they're like, no, 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 we want birch. And they're like, this is birch. And they're like, we want it with the white on the outside. And so they're like, okay. So they make it with the white on the outside. And of course, at the end of the season, it's leaking. And so it became a very profitable business for the Abenaki people to make these settlers canoes with the white on the outside, knowing it was wrong because the lentil sills were going to allow it to leak in that direction. But it's that kind of knowledge that helps, you know, save every little bit. So are we good? Any other questions? Thank you for your time.
Can you start a podcast, Judy?
No, I have done a lot of podcasts. They're out there.
Yeah, I'll have to look for them. Yeah, I love it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Judy. That was really helpful. And I know that with that foundation, as we're working up our strategies and thinking about our ideas to combat climate change, you know, we can tap you as a resource to dive deeper into these ideas. So thanks again.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So with that, we're going to take a quick break for our first opportunity for public comment. If anyone from the public is interested in sharing some comments or questions briefly at this time, please raise your hand in Zoom or otherwise identify yourself. We will have another opportunity for public comment near the end of the meeting. Okay, I see Jennifer. Anyone else at this time? Okay, Jennifer, why don't you take a couple minutes to share your comments with the group?
I wanted to thank Judy so much for this. And I really wanted to point out, this is a remarkable opportunity. I've served on the State Endangered Species Committee and the Flora Advisory Committee and various other, I'm a Western science product. And I think never has there been an opportunity like the Vermont Climate Council and the influence that traditional ecological knowledge, for example, can have on our recommendations and our strategies moving forward. So I think this is just a remarkable opportunity. And I really thank Judy. And I don't want Judy to be the only voice, and I don't want Judy to be the only person. So I'm glad that there are many of you who are taking this in. One of the things I wanted to mention was how easy it is to think of traditional ecological knowledge as good science, as good Western science. I know I did that. I was naive, and I had my first student who was working in the Arctic in the early 1990s. And I kept saying to her, well, it's good Western science. That's what it is. It's good science. And what I was doing was diminishing the value of the holistic nature of it. And so I have a very Western scientific question for Judy, and that is, can you point us to particular papers that I know you said that you would provide some resources? And again, I don't want you to be the only one doing this hard work. But what I teach climate change at Emerson in Boston. What I'm really looking for, because I include TEK, is something that really describes that parallel and important synergy that Western science and TEK can have. So if you end up coming upon any particular sources that I have several video clips and films that I have the students watch, but I would really appreciate that. And I think we would all benefit from something that doesn't portray TEK as simply good Western science.
You're right. I have tons of books that address that. I'll put together a list. It's not going to be difficult at all.
Wonderful.
Because I think it would be helpful to get across the point that you're saying, that it's not good Western science. It's another knowledge, another way of thinking, and that together they'll solve the problem. Thanks.
So much.
Thanks, Jennifer. All right. So at this point, we're going to move on to some brief updates from our task groups. I need to step away for a quick second. So Abby, would you mind running us through that agenda item?
Sure. Who wants to go first? Ryan, are you there? Or whose face do I see? Lauren, why don't you update us on nature-based solutions?
Thanks, Abby. Nature-based solutions met on Tuesday. We are starting to revise our list of recommendations into what's and how's categories, which is something I think I missed last week's subcommittee meeting. Apologies, everyone. But Ali said in the conversation last week, we were really thinking of the level of specificity as kind of like the generic, what we're hoping to accomplish, and with some level of specificity, but not too much, how we hope to accomplish that. So we're revising our list of strategies to fit into those two buckets of detail and work, to hopefully then be able to scan through the MCA with those that appear to really elevate to the top of those strategies we want to recommend to the full subcommittee. So we're working on revising that now, and we'll be walking through our final list next week.
Excellent. Ryan, how's ag emissions going?
Sorry, looking for all the unmute buttons. Ag emissions is going well. Moving forward, continuing to have, I think, some robust discussions. I think we are working on trying to find the proper degree of granularity with which to represent a host of programs and strategies that we've been discussing for the past couple of weeks. Looking to the charge, looking to reconcile that with the presentation we received the week prior about some of the higher level themes, and working to provide as specific recommendations that is supported by the detailed discussions we've had about specific programs and strategies is, I think, the big lift for next week's meeting. The agency staff, we're going to take a crack at putting some of those higher level discussions for higher order organizational strategies pen to paper for discussion and dissection in our meeting next Thursday. So continuing to meet and make progress, and a good I think set of top recommendations to be made. And as always, welcome anyone else from the group to share their thoughts, what I missed, what I misrepresented. Hopefully I didn't misrepresent anything. Thanks.
Sounded like a solid update to me, and I see no other. Let's see. So Billy, do you want to update on?
Sure. So the Forest Natural and Forested Working Lands group met earlier this week, a subset of us, and we had a good conversation about our kind of path forward. We've kind of mapped out our meetings for the next few weeks of what we're going to try to accomplish. We were effectively closing our kind of assemblage of initial strategies at the end of this week so that we can organize them and try to kind of group and reduce redundancy. I'll be working with the staff on that so that we can come out with some kind of, top line strategies and then have more granular implementation steps beneath those and discuss those as a group next time. And this kind of feeds into the conversation that we're going to have a little bit later this morning of exactly, how we organize all this stuff, given that I think what, the council is looking for at the end of July is fairly high level, but we know that we're going to be getting deeper into the details of strategies and sub strategies before then. So just making sure that we kind of capture those in an organized way. So we're making some progress. We may need to try to find some extra meeting times between now and the end of July to get it done. But I think we're doing okay.
It sounds like your group and 5E are in similar situations. We met this morning before this meeting and did Lauren put together some Jamboarding, and I think we're trying to working through what are the the top 3 to 5 buckets or whatever of strategies or tactics that we want to take. We talked a lot about Alyssa introduced a really great thought process around kind of the end users. So who or what capacity are we attempting to bolster in the work that we're doing, and then sort of working backwards from that to figure out how we start to build that out, and talking a lot about natural capital, human capital, and social capital, and how the programs and strategies fit out within those. So I think we're like you said, Billy, we're on a good path forward, just trying to start the work of grouping and distilling. And I have to pull up the agenda because I can't remember what's.
I got it right
carbon budget hasn't met, correct?
We had one initial meeting. I think now that the contractor is on, we're going to activate. I know Ryan has had some contact with a member of a different relevant subcommittee to talk about coordination. So I think we're really going to get rolling. I think Jane will invite us to the larger meeting she spoke of earlier, or potentially as around the launch, but I think we will likely be activating in a bigger way in the coming weeks. And Ryan and Jane, feel free to chime in there if I got that wrong.
I think that sounds great. I just wanted to also let you know that as Science and Data was working through some work planning this week, Brian Gray became the sort of task group lead, not sort of, the task group lead for Science and Data on this issue, recognizing that most of the scientific work for the analyses will be coordinated through that subcommittee, but this one had more momentum through ag and ecosystems. So they just wanted one person to sort of come into your group and sort of learn from what you guys are up to and then report back to Science and Data.
Great. I know Brian has reached out to Ryan and I, so I think that process has begun. Okay, so Abby, did you get everyone? Did you get Just Transition as well?
Oh my gosh, I did not. Iris, or would you like to update us on JT?
Not sure that I actually, no worries. I'm not sure I have any updates more than what Jane has said earlier, because we have moved to every other week meeting schedule. So the meeting last night was between Jane, David, and the co-chairs. But so you're all good. Yeah.
I know that for myself, I'm so interested to dive into the guiding principles, and being able to hear Kaya talk about that on the co-chairs and steering committee meeting on, was that Monday? I'm losing track of days. On Monday was really grounding and very helpful. So I'm really looking forward to how we incorporate all of that really amazing and in-depth work into everything that we're doing here. Billy, are we to granularity? Is that our next piece?
Yeah, and sorry, this is a weird terminology, but I think really it's just to have a quick check-in with everyone around this idea of like how we're organizing our recommendations. And if this is something we don't think we need to talk about much, then we don't need to. But I just want to share my screen and pull something up quickly. Where is it? Hold on. Here we go. So let me know when you can see that. Okay, good. So this is a PowerPoint that Jane shared with the steering committee. I think she shared it with our group at a previous meeting. This is kind of an output from the Maine Climate Council's Transportation Working Group. And I think Jane shared it as an example of how the level of kind of detail and granularity she was anticipating we would present to the council at the end of July. And, I think Jane is still with us, hopefully, so she can chime in on this. But, I think she represented that maybe like this top line of strategy would be the level of detail that, the commission would be looking for. And I know we had a conversation with the steering committee earlier in the week around whether that level of detail would be sufficient to even engage meaningful input and public engagement around, since it's such a kind of a vague strategy that it's hard not to like something like that, right? So wondering if we need direction from the steering committee to go deeper. I think regardless, our work over the next couple of months is going to go deeper. I know you all have been compiling much more detailed and kind of prescriptive ideas and strategies in the course of your work, understanding that we're still really looking at a kind of a co-creation model with the public and affected communities. But there are ideas out there that we're aware of that are detailed, and we're capturing them now. So, I think what Maine did is they've got the top line strategy, they've got kind of a more clearly articulated goal, and then some implementation steps that drill down into more detail. I suspect this is more or less what we're all thinking already about how to structure our work. I know with the task group that I'm leading up, we've already given that some thought. I had an example of it up, but now I can't find it. But where we've kind of begun to organize our strategies in that way. So just wanted to put that up and get an initial reaction from folks to make sure that what I'm thinking is the way we're going to kind of tier the different levels of detail and organize them thematically is more or less what you're all thinking. And if not, if we need to spend some more time talking about that.
I'm wondering, do we have I'm sorry, maybe Jane is going to answer my question without me asking it. So Jane, I'm going to let you go.
Okay. So I just want to sort of dig into like where I've gotten to this week with templates and engagement and some thought around that. So that presentation, I walked through the main templates with the Climate Access and Rise this week to think about how and what they're going to use for their engagement in anticipation of their public engagement plan coming out in July. They sort of pushed back on these presentations and said that they feel like it's their job to communicate, like to make the collateral that they'll use to work with the public. So, which was a little surprising, I'll just say to me, and we've had a little bit of back and forth. So they now have with them your policy template, as well as these ideas of these slide decks, and are supposed to get comments back to me today on what components of the policy template versus a slide deck can they anticipate would be most useful for them to ultimately do their engagement with later in the summer around. So they could come back and say that a slide deck seems great and this is the right path. They may come back and just say that by filling out and populating the policy template to this degree is all they need to then produce their materials, and they might not need you to take it any farther. So I just wanted to suggest that that we're still discussing that. I also, well, a couple other thoughts. The policy template I have gotten, thanks to Judson, I got some suggested revisions around how to incorporate the IPCC language, as well as I made a specific comment that I heard from you last week, Alyssa, and I haven't shared that again for actual use by you all. And so I, either later today or for next week, will update the supporting document on the website so the public can see it, and then share it with all of you so that as you are working in your task groups, you have the most up-to-date version of the policy template to use that has these revisions incorporated. Finally, I'll just say that regardless of what Climate Access and RISE need in order to do what they see as appropriate engagement at a higher level, there will likely still need to be a stepwise approach with respect to stakeholder engagement and how we work to inform constituents that have a vital stake in the policies and ideas you're all coming up with. So CBI and I are meeting the three facilitators, Pat Field, Catherine, and David, on Tuesday next week to think more specifically about communication tools for stakeholder engagement. And so I think that there will still be a slide deck, but it may be more specific than what you have in front of you, because when you're talking specifically to your constituents, then we might want to go into more detail. So I just want to sort of say, I think it's right to be thinking about the level of specificity, but really for now, I would focus in on the policy template that we have and how you're thinking about populating that component of the work. And stay tuned. Hopefully next week I can provide a little bit more clarity around what both our engagement and outreach specialists want, as well as what we think we'll need for stakeholder engagement.
Okay, thanks, Jane. So basically, an understanding that we're going to be developing strategies at a range of granularity, and that you're going to get back to us with how we need to kind of format that information going into both the targeted outreach to impacted communities and kind of broader stakeholder engagement later this summer. Okay. I don't know if anyone has any questions, whether this conversation is helpful or confusing, but I just thought that it would be good to get some clarity, at least for me, around it.
So is the policy template I'm sorry, I'm starting to get all of the different things mixed up. Is the policy template the same? And apologize, the lawn is being mowed, so you might not be able to hear me very well. Is that the big spreadsheet, or is that different? Okay. Is there okay. Thank you.
So like one of the questions I had is like, with that spreadsheet, like I have a natural inclination to kind of like create some more structure within it, right? Like instead of just having like a list of things, like there's a group that is focused on land conservation, a group that's focused on kind of land use planning and regulation. So like, it seems like there's an opportunity even within that spreadsheet to kind of create some of those tiers of those hierarchies. So I guess if you're already looking at it, Jane, you can give some thought to what that looks like. Cool. Okay. Any other thoughts? You know, this is all kind of bureaucratic stuff, but I think it's just helpful to know where we're heading as we really start rolling with developing a recommendation. So thanks for your patience, everybody. Anything else anyone would like to raise on this topic? Okay. Next quick thing I want to just run over with folks. Let me share my screen. Is just this work plan. You know, this is kind of where we left off last week. Long and short of it is we're here now at June 11th, amazingly. 2 weeks left till winter starts again. And then the next couple weeks, you know, next week we're going to continue to be doing work at our task group level. Then the week of the 25th, I think we're hoping to hear from the ag task group with introduction to their recommendations. And then we're going to hope to get the other 3 groups in to share their recommendations in the first week of July. And depending on how much time we need, that might go a little bit further into July. The idea being that we'd want the full subcommittee briefed up on the various task groups work by the kind of beginning, middle of July, so that we can all work to collectively finalize the recommendations that we're going to deliver to the council at the end of the month. So just any questions, further discussion, this is more of just a reminder and a confirmation that this is the kind of path that we're on. I can't see everybody, so shout out or raise your hands if you have any comments. Okay, good. Just checking some boxes. So the last piece that I want to touch on before we can get into more substantive conversation is around outside presenters. We had a good conversation about that last week. Last thing I'll share today is the kind of updated chart that I've been keeping. Hopefully you all can see that right now. You'll see, right here was Judy and her great presentation on June 11th. Next week, next Thursday evening, as you know, there's a scheduled presentation from Just Transitions around the guiding principles and equity screen. That is a separate meeting that we'd encourage you all to attend. And then it looks like we're likely going to be able to have folks from Vermont Fish and Wildlife and the Nature Conservancy to come in on our regular scheduled meeting on the 18th to talk about Vermont conservation design and TNC's resilient and connected landscape. Abby is working with some folks at UVM to schedule them for the next week, the 25th, to talk about their climate assessment and ideally the resilience matrix. And then, looking a little further out, we're thinking maybe we would have a broad conversation around soil carbon, soil health, and farm to plate, in early July with some other presentations to follow. Judy generously suggested I reach out to Jake to see if he wanted to kind of piggyback on her presentation today, but I think that, it was good to spend the time that we did talking about TEK. So I think we'll certainly find time for Jake in June or in early July to talk about farm to plate. So just wanted to, again, put this in front of everyone, make sure I'm aware of any questions or comments. We're going to try to shoehorn these in largely into our regular meeting. We discussed whether we want to extend our meetings by, say, a half an hour by starting at 9:30, maybe when we get into mid-June, early July. And it would be interesting to get some thoughts as to whether folks want to do that. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and then we can just touch base on this schedule.
Hey, Billy, can we just confirm, so after this today at noon, there's no other session today after this one on Vermont conservation design?
Correct.
Okay. My calendar is full of real meetings and then holds for fictional meetings, and sometimes they get jumbled together. So
right, I apologize. At one point we thought we might try to go into this afternoon, but I don't think there was a lot of interest in that. So we'll just kind of proceed apace with that outline unless others feel we should do something different. Going once, going twice. Okay. Well, we'll continue to keep trying to schedule folks, keep you posted, and update that list as we go along, and the agendas for meetings in advance, so you know what's coming. And as we get those outside folks presenting, I will do my best to get materials from them, slide decks in advance of meetings, so you all can review them, so you're not going in blind and can have questions teed up. Okay, right on time. So we've got about 15 minutes for a broader conversation, if there's any topics that folks want to bring to the group right now.
I noticed that Judy wrote in the chat earlier, where would the electricity come from? Our grids are not big enough to handle the influx of solar panels now. I don't know if we wanted, I think that in some way ties into some of the broader conversations we've had in our other kind of unstructured brainstorm times. I don't know if we want to talk about that type of issue that comes up in these conversations, or just wanting to note it. We hadn't called it out, Judy, and I wanted to make sure that it, you know, we spoke to it at some point.
My concern was 2040 electric cars, the Maine, the slide you showed from Maine. Where will all the electricity come from for that?
That's a good question. That's something that, you know, I want to raise with the cross-sector mitigation group. You know, I'm assuming that they're building all of their modeling around an increased reliance on electricity, since, you know, the core recommendations of that group are going to be around electrifying transportation and thermal applications. So I believe there's been kind of modeling to show what that future electric demand looks like. And then as a result, what sort of generation we'll need. You know, not all of that power has to come from Vermont. We're part of a regional grid, but I expect there'll be some expectation for a lot of it to come from here. I know that the state and regional planning commissions have done some pretty extensive mapping and have determined that there's quite a bit of appropriately developable land in the state to support solar, that by almost a magnitude of 5 exceeds the amount of land that we would need to reach our 2050 goals. But the grid constraints that you raised, Judy, you know, is a whole nother factor. Part of the state, you know, the northeast part of the state, or I guess it's the Northwest, has some real constraints given the amount of transmission capacity, the lack of demand, and the significant amount of power that's coming through from Canada through that part of the state. And there's active work to relieve that sort of grid constraint right now. But again, these are all things I'm hoping that cross-sector is looking at. And, you know, Lauren, as our liaison to that group, might be able to speak to that.
Well, the point too I'm trying to make is if it comes from Hydro-Quebec, every time they have to expand, they're taking the lands from Indigenous people. And we have to look at this particular issue globally. They've already disrupted. I think the dam is, last I heard, it was like 25 miles long through the middle of numerous villages that had to relocate. And I have asked this question several times. We keep talking about solar, 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 but nobody has been able to tell me, have we been able to find a solution to recycle the bad things that are in the solar panels when they fail? Because I remember when they first came out, they were comparing them to the thermometers that everybody was reclaiming because there was mercury in it. And I know there are bad things within the solar panels. And I think that if we're going to keep pushing solar, we need to figure out what we're going to do with the stuff inside. And, you know, where is all this coming from? Is it, again, thinking globally, who's making these solar panels? Who's the workforce? Is it impacting Indigenous people?
All good questions. I can say in my day job, I am working to organize a series of webinar trainings around the question of kind of end-of-life disposition of solar panels and batteries with folks from A&R solid waste and hazardous waste divisions, as well as folks in the energy development community. We're kind of finalizing the agenda for that. And once we have some dates for those conversations, I will share them with this group. You know, they'll be open to the public, I believe. But yeah, the absolute intent is, you know, how are we going to manage that waste stream as we are decommissioning these facilities as there's attrition in panels. How do we recycle, reuse them, ensure that there's not contamination of air, water, soils, et cetera. So very important issue that I know that no folks are looking at.
Well, and it goes on too, Billy. We've discussed this in our group, that the sheep, people are putting sheep to maintain the grass underneath the solar panels. And yet there's limited amount of places to have the sheep butchered. And so they have to transport the sheep out of state. I talked to one farmer about this, and she told me there's a waiting list of a year to get your sheep butchered. And if you don't get on the list, you have to send them out of state. So that seems counterintuitive to, you know, how to maintain the solar panels. But it also, these right here in my backyard, the state gave somebody 7 acres to put up a solar panel array, and it's cut off the route for the bear and the deer, and it fragmented it between the farmer directly behind me on one side and the 100 acres we have. And so there has to be some consideration as to how these solar panels, how and where these solar panels are placed, and how do we deal with the recycling of them when their time is up.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And, you know, I think perhaps one of the recommendations that comes out of our group is that there needs to be increased support for in-state meat processing, so that, you know, if those dual uses exist, there is the capacity to manage it here. And absolutely those issues of siting are front of mind for me. That's, again, as my day job, I kind of help regulate those projects for the state, and we're always concerned about the natural resource impacts of energy development. Even though we certainly need renewables and the state's committed to them, they need to be done in an appropriately sited way. And as they become our dominant source of energy in the future, we're going to need to treat them as the landscape use that they are, and really make sure it's done well. So my hope is that this group can give some good thought to those questions that you're raising.
Yeah, I would just say that at least that's a lot of what the some of those pieces I haven't been able to dive fully into Farm to Plate's strategic plan yet. So this is not like completely fresh in my mind. So Jake could jump in if he wants to or not. But I think in our task group, those are the types of things that we're trying to think about. How we've been calling our group the kitchen sink group. And for this type of a reason, to your point, Judy and Billy, that right, if sheep are a mechanism with which to maintain perennial grasses, which is a good sequestration strategy underneath renewable energy siting, that I assume we will have recommendations as to where and how that is done equitably. That then the sheep that need a place to go, there needs to be a market for the sheep, there needs to be infrastructure for the farmer, there needs to be a viability stream for that entire enterprise. And so those are the things that we're hoping to try to address somewhat and bring to you all with our thoughts and practices that certainly, as you know, nobody wants to talk about slaughterhouse infrastructure, but it's actually a component of all of this, and how we, you know, make sure that the entirety of, you know, from the creation of the solar power all the way through, we've tried to think about how that's structured so that to the just transitions guiding principles point, you know, fairness to all living beings has been considered. Is it Friday by any chance?
Well, just to kind of keep our keep in practice, or maybe get ready to have more arguments. Another one of Judy's questions triggers for me a larger thought that I've seen, at least as I think about the working lands, the ag and forest piece of our work. that we've talked about in our task groups that's common to both, which is the threat of conversion to development, whether it's energy, development, solar development, or it's, subdivisions. And what are the tools for that? And are there regulatory tools to deal with that? Which of course we do. We have local land use regulation, we have Act 250, we have Section 248 and the Public Utility Commission process. And do we want to veer in our recommendations as a group into the place of saying we need better planning, better land use planning, and we need better protections to protect prime ag soils and prime ag lands, and to protect our forests from fragmentation and overdevelopment. Converting. I'm all in favor of adding to our state's ability to support our own energy needs, so we don't continue to create a market for Hydro-Quebec power. And I also recognize that can potentially come at a cost. And in some ways, whether it's subdivisions, strip malls, or solar, I don't mean to equate it false. There's equivalency in terms of environmental impact between strip malls and solar. But wherever that development happens is for the most part driven by market decisions. What are those developers are looking at pricing, and if the two key tools that the public has for helping to address that are to basically saying, here's some places you just can't do that work, and also if we're going to require people to do it elsewhere, to tell them where we want them to do it. That's the planning piece. And then also, to the extent it's more expensive to do it in that place, it's rooftop development or solar, or it's, in a village centers and downtowns, then we have to figure out what are the economic challenges to that. Is it infrastructure, like local wastewater infrastructure and water? Is it just it's more expensive and we need to provide a subsidy? But those all feel like, to me, important, if not, foundational to the recommendations that this group makes. And I recognize that they're a little bit outside of the kind of what we might think of as a traditional wheelhouse as we think about what others may be thinking about our recommendations. So I wanted to flag those as themes that others in the task groups have heard me make in those settings, but I wanted to raise it to the larger group to see if others who aren't on those task groups have perspectives and want to weigh in.
Well, we talked today about potentially, how do we shift within our public institutions? Because, in terms of policy, ultimately, that's a lot, seems to me, where we have the ability to more deeply control potentially or shift. Is it that, VHCB or the Working Lands Enterprise Board, and then maybe to your point, David, within the development realm, do we need to have either a climate person that's, it becomes a part of state policy that like a climate person is built into those processes so that the lens of climate is within those? Is it that in order to access certain subsidies or grants, there needs to be a climate adaptation or resilience lens or a component, so I'm thinking about with Farm and Forest Viability Program, when you're applying for those funds, there's a matrix through which we pass, projects up through that. And does climate need to become a component of how we're thinking about those things? And so that might be sort of a specific recommendation strategy that we could bring forward as to how to start to integrate to your point, how we want to start to build this out in ways that create what we want to see. What are the mechanisms that we can use to do that? Judy?
Gadakna has an employee who works on a climate change committee in Maine. And I'm a little concerned about the always recommending or always referring to what Maine has said and what Maine has done. Because what I hear from her all the time is how terrible it is. And I sent Abby a link the other day about composting in their state, and and the problem it was having on water, clean water quality. And the fact that it was directly connected with bringing waste from out of state. And so I took that video and I took that thought and I did a little research to see if our state was doing that. And they were indeed doing that. And so it just seems to me that we shouldn't be always saying what Maine did was the answer. I think we should look at what Maine did with a questionable lens, just as you would with anything else.
I'm about to put in the chat the VEIC Solar Pathways report from 2016 that spent some time looking at the amount of land is anticipated being needed for a high saturation of solar in Vermont, and then kind of the land that appears to be developable for solar based on the Act 174 regional energy planning analysis that, you know, filtered out things like prime soil and wetlands and certain necessary wildlife habitat. And there appears to be, you know, as I said earlier, a significant amount more land that could be developed than would be needed. At A&R, we've taken the next step of kind of coarsely subtracting forested acres from those totals, and there still seems to be a surplus of available developable land. You know, it's not to say that there's all that land is available. Not everyone's going to want to put solar on their property, but I think, you know, my conclusion is that we have options, we have alternatives to achieve our renewable generation goals in the state as far as where we site those facilities. So now's the time to be really smart about identifying the areas that we want to see them, the areas that we think should be avoided, and you know, kind of setting those sideboards so that the industry can move forward with good guidance.
Okay, I'll jump in then. My hand's up, but you might not be able to see it with the backlight. To Billy's point, I think this is a really good conversation now. I think it'll also be a really fruitful conversation next week, because I think, Billy, based on the screen share that you had, our presentation is going to be on Vermont conservation design and the resilient and connected network, which are two different tools that can be used to kind of determine areas that we would really like to protect from development and areas that are that have less significant ecosystem and natural resource values that we would like to see maybe, you know, direct some of that development towards instead. So just flagging that, as hopefully we'll talk about this again next week too.
I'm just glancing at the time. Does anybody else have anything they sort of want to throw into the mix? Okay. Shoot, I minimized the agenda again.
I think at this point we're just talking about what we're going to discuss next week. And I guess just before we move on, I think, you know, these are all really great questions that, you know, Judy and others are raising. And, you know, I think this is what we're probably going to spend most of July doing as a group, right? Like once we have some initial strategies and recommendations bubble up from the task groups, then we're all going to kind of kick the tires and talk about the pros and cons of each and the concerns that they may raise on, you know, these and other considerations, and hopefully work together to you know, address those concerns in whatever we bring forward. And there may be places where we disagree, but my hope is that we're going to spend time digging into these exact questions. And then presumably we're going to have to do the same for the recommendations coming out of other subcommittees down the road, right? We're going to receive draft recommendations from cross-sector and other groups. And my hope is that the process gives us some ownership of those ideas and an opportunity to vet them as well. All right. So next week, we're going to have a presentation on Vermont conservation design and TNC's resilient and connected landscape. We're going to have updates from our task groups, some open conversation like we just had. Are there other topics, and Abby and I and Jane can give some thought to this after the meeting, but are there other specific agenda items that folks would like to take up next week? Okay. That's easy. You can always shoot us a message. Abby and I are open to feedback. It can be anonymous. You can send us a typewritten letter with no signature telling us that you hate our meetings and want to tell us how to do it differently. So
Yeah,
always
true.
open to that sort of feedback.
You guys can take over. You can overthrow us. It's fine.
But I think, we've been doing a lot of kind of process heavy stuff. I think now we're getting into the kind of foundation setting and sharing of information and knowledge, which is great. And then in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be getting into, looking at actual recommendations and, running them through different filters and tools and talking about them. So hopefully that will be more exciting than what we've been doing. Not that this hasn't been great so far.
Billy, Jane just asked in the chat, and is the subcommittee interested in the carbon budget, learning more about it and having the tech consultants join? And I'm starting to see yes, pleases. Yeah,
I think that's great. Maybe we can, you, Jane, and I can talk about how we integrate that into next week's agenda.
Okay.
Okay. And then assignment wise, I think really the work is happening in the task group. So I'd encourage you all just to stick with that. I suspect we will have some materials from next week's presenters that we can get out to you all well in advance. I know that they've done this presentation before, so I would imagine they've got materials at the ready that I'll try to dig up early next week and get out to you all so you can have those and review before we meet. Okay, anything else before we move on to public comment? Okay. Any members of the public interested in sharing comments with the subcommittee at this time? Please raise your hand or make yourselves known. I almost thought we were going to get out of here early today. Zach, Graham, anybody else? Okay, well, why don't we go in that order? Zach and then Graham, take a couple minutes to share your thoughts with the group.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Zach Porter, Conservation Law Foundation. Sorry to keep you a little bit longer here. I just wanted to thank Judy for the fantastic presentation this morning, and thanks to the subcommittee for giving that time and space. And I hope there's more conversation around that topic as this goes on. And I wanted to also say, I think, clearly there's already interest from the whole subcommittee, but the topic of the carbon budget does seem very relevant here. And so glad that seems like it'll happen. And then, wanted to circle back to the topic of presenters. There was a line in the list that Billy shared for kind of forest carbon or natural ecosystem carbon storage. And I wanted to thank you all for adding that line in there. And it looks like there are a couple of people in consideration at the moment. I wanted to just add in a couple more names for you all to look at. Jonathan Thompson is a really excellent researcher at Harvard Forest, who I hope you might look into bringing in here. Very involved with the Wildlands and Woodlands program. And I also want to mention Beverly Law at Oregon State, who is also excellent and very widely recognized for her knowledge in that area. So yeah, those two people in particular, Bev Law, Jonathan Thompson, just to add a couple more options to that list of potential speakers. But yeah, thanks, and have a great day, great weekend. Take care.
Thank you, Zach.
Jonathan Thompson is part of the team of consultants who will be working on the carbon budget for us. So if we invite them in next week, then hopefully he would be part of that presentation.
Perfect.
Super. Thanks, Zach. Graham.
Good morning, folks. Thanks for your ongoing work on this, and thanks, Judy, for that presentation today. I think I have primarily two things I wanted to comment on today, and one is sort of in solidarity and agreement with the questions about looking beyond the very localized questions about emissions and how what we're doing here is connected to greater processes in the world which have emissions of their own. So in particular, Alyssa was great and offered to meet with me last week and talk to me a little bit about the Vermont emissions by sector. And we looked at the ag a little bit. And I just want to encourage the folks that are looking at that breakdown to do some deeper diving into those numbers. It says that 53% of Vermont's emissions by the ag sector are due to enteric fermentation. I would encourage you to look at Jason Rowentree's research out of University of Michigan, where he critiques significantly how methane from enteric fermentation is actually calculated, and assesses also how that may not be broken out by management method, and also how it doesn't take into account natural methane cycling in the atmosphere from natural sources like cattle as opposed to industrial sources. I also recognize, and listen, I talked a little about this, how it's hard to capture certain things in its analysis. And I'm looking here at the presentation given to the Climate Council, and it says that the default data used was from the USDA on animal populations, crop data, and soils data. So I don't believe we have any, for example, data here that relates on-farm use of pesticides, on-farm machinery use, on-farm synthetic fertilizer use, the production of those compounds, the production of that equipment, the actual emissions on site that are factored in here. And I understand that there are challenges about factoring in global transportation networks, regional transportation networks, the manufacturing, and how to fit that all in here. But I think it's really critical because if we look at, for example, like the rubric created by the Agroecology and Livelihoods Collective at UVM, which they worked on last year, it really gets into looking at a more holistic picture of some of these impacts. And if we don't ask some of those questions, we really don't get to differentiating between the different types of farming, agricultural, and food systems that we have in the state, and looking at the difference between folks who are using a lot less fossil fuel-based machinery on their land or in their ag, or are using localized food networks as opposed to global food networks, and the difference in outcomes. So I'd just encourage some more questioning of that data and what's being presented as a picture of ag emissions by sector in Vermont currently. And secondly, I wanted to flag an issue which I'm not sure is on your table, but it's certainly been being advocated on by two major ag organizations in Vermont, and that's the Northeast Organic Farming Association in rural Vermont as part of the Vermont Cannabis Equity Coalition. So this is the coming cannabis tax and regulate market in Vermont. And if anyone has been paying attention to this, the law was unfortunately written with a terrible amount of a lack of agricultural literacy and concern for equity, both for racial equity as well as social and agricultural economic equity. So this industry is going to be largely driven towards warehouse-based indoor growing. If you've looked at the outcomes in California and Colorado and similar states, that type of cannabis growing is exceptionally, presents an amazing amount of electrical draw on the state's power grid and have greenhouse gas emissions consequences. And I think it would be incumbent upon this group in particular to look very specifically at how that law is written. And the recommendation I would look for you all to lobby the folks who certainly set you up on this task to make changes would be to say, they've essentially said cannabis is going to be considered a commercial zoning designation, which means it's not considered agricultural. It can't be grown on agricultural land. It must be grown on land designated as commercial zoning, which basically means it's not going to be grown outside under the sun. It's going to be grown in warehouses. It's not going to be very accessible for people who don't have much money or who come from historically marginalized communities, which don't have a lot of access to capital. And I just want you all to look at it more. Check out the numbers from California and Colorado. When rural Vermont submits our comments, we'll give you some details on that. But I think you have a lot of opportunity here to significantly affect something which is going to be coming up in the next couple of years and dramatically impacting Vermont's electricity use, water quality, et cetera. It could also significantly affect people's bottom lines in the ag sector and in all kinds of sectors if it's going to be a distributed wealth generating marketplace as opposed to one that's oriented towards indoor growing and large corporate actors. So I'll leave those thoughts with you today. And thank you again for your work.
Graham, thank you so much for that. I did just want to say, as you and I have talked some about the cannabis issue, so I will get that more into our kitchen sink group thinking. But I did also want to say that we have talked some at the ag emissions level about some of the tension around how enteric fermentation is calculated. And there's also some interesting research being done at UC Davis around this as well. One of the problems that we're running into with that is that and Ryan or Judson can maybe help me if I get this wrong, but as I understand it, the IPCC and therefore the following, everything that comes from that has categorized enteric fermentation and as livestock as an anthropogenic emission, not a biogenic emission, which is something that, personally from the things I understand, I take issue with, but that's one of the tension points that we're running into is that knowledge and data is still sort of a little bit more developmental and not as commonly accepted or understood. And so it's been flagged and noted. That's all I can say at this point, but it is in the conversation.
Thanks, Abby. I think we're more or less at time now, but I see Robert has raised his hand. So if you do have a comment, Mr. Limmert, please make it brief and make it now.
Sure. Please call me Rob. I just wanted to comment that vis-a-vis methane specifically, there is significant evidence that the use of biocarbon as a manure lagoon cover reduces the emissions of various gases, nitrogen, and various other strong, potent greenhouse gases. And the use of biochar in animal feeding reduces enteric emissions and results in significantly healthier cows, more productive cows. I have an article which I've shared with Ryan and Billy and others, Alyssa, which goes into this in some detail. This is something which is going on in neighboring states and is something that should be looked at. It's possible to reduce enteric emissions very significantly, 30-40%, and at the same time allow the manure that is produced by these animals to be immobilized and better suited for distribution on fields. You should take a look at it. This is the time.
Great. Thank you, Rob, for that. We certainly will. Great. Well, thanks everybody for another good meeting, especially Judy. Thank you for all the information and knowledge you brought to us today. And if folks have any suggestions for next week, please feel free to write Abby or I directly. And otherwise, have a great weekend. I'm going to stop recording now. Thanks.
Have a good
Thank you.
weekend.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone.